This is a 30-minute distillation of the majority leader's first meeting on phase one of the fair share. Mandates that were a rat that was crammed into an unrelated bill on tax abatements for conservation easements. Senate Bill 998.
I'd be interested if members of the committee could just take a couple minutes to define the problem, and that can be both the opportunities but the challenges that exist in housing with developing housing from the seat that you sit in. Mr. Marconi.
Thank you. One of the things that I know small towns are concerned about is a one-size-fits-all approach, and that we need to look at each individual community and what the assets are, specifically relative to transportation, for example. I can tell you that in the town of Ridgefield, transportation would be key to getting people to move into our community, because although we have some affordable housing, we have about 3% at this point and look to continue to build more, especially under a TOD in the Branchville section of our town. But the issue is when we have people move into town, we don't have the transportation to get them back to their jobs if they're moving out of the cities or some of the more highly dense populations. And that's true for the northwest section, northeast, southeast. As you look around our state, the current build out is happening in the cities where there is good transportation, where there are a lot of jobs. And that's how I feel we need to approach this, is to create not only the affordable housing component, but we also have to make a serious investment in our transportation as well. And then jobs, most importantly. Where are the jobs going to be, not today, but in the future? And what are we looking at in terms of those centers? But I definitely think that the housing we look at, and this is the last thing I'll say, doesn't necessarily have to be affordable for people who are in a particular class. I believe there's a broad range of affordability that is needed. We are looking at right now something called the Gen Y, Gen Z development of about 45 units that would be specific to young people between the age of 21, 22 up to like 35 maybe, if that's what the Gen Y, Gen Z age group is. And they're designed to be built smaller, which will make them more affordable. And you don't necessarily have to approach it from an 8-30G perspective. I think we need to begin thinking outside the box and do a mixed development that includes the young with senior affordable, which would have an affordability component to it. It has to be a little larger. But I think that's the direction we need to look at, that we have to look at this in terms of specificity to an area and not one size fits all from the state. Thank you.
Anybody else want to talk about the problem issue, or besides?
Yeah, I'd like to discuss some of the issues that we've heard from some of our smaller communities, and that is the issue of water and wastewater capacity. And I know I had conversations with Representative Rojas and others about this last session. There are some of the regional councils of government that have done some studies on wastewater capacity and actually tried to then develop solutions to address those issues, and that was one of them I saw was a Southeastern Connecticut Council of Government. And I think that needs to be a first step, because it always comes up in conversation that certain communities lack water and wastewater capacity, but we really don't have a lot of detail as to what those challenges are, whether those can be addressed and how they can be addressed. So I think we need some kind of baseline study, or either build on some of the studies that the COGS have done to try to get a better handle on that, because it is a very difficult issue to address, but there is some federal and state funding that could be targeted to resolving that issue.
Thank you. Yes.
Francis Pickering, WestCog. What we're seeing here is a state, national, and international problem. If you read the national, international news, it is as bad as it is in Connecticut, or worse, for instance, in Canada and California when it comes to housing affordability. I think what we've seen across the country and much of the developed world in the last 40 years is stagnant incomes, wage deflation. Once upon a time, it was possible for a single income household say, working in a factory to buy a house. That is no longer possible. Even dual income households are challenged. Part of this is driven by a variety of factors I'll get to. Part of it is market driven. We have seen over the last 60 or 70 years a tripling of home size and a tripling of home cost. It's almost a perfect correlation. When you look at the other side of it, not market demand, whether it's what the builders are building or what home buyers and renters are looking for, Robert Dietz, the chief economist for the National Association of Home Builders, lays out the 5 L's that drive housing cost, which is lots, laws, lending, lumber, and labor. Not to be too pithy here, but all of these are factors that drive the cost. We are working at WestCog on a pie chart that shows what feeds into housing cost. And if we are adequately to address housing affordability gaps, we need to focus on all of these slices of the pie. It's simply not possible to delete a slice. You cannot build a house without labor or without materials. In Connecticut, well, we've had a lot of discussion about regulation, a lot of discussion about zoning, and zoning can be a cost driver for housing, but we are one of 4 states that exempts affordable housing from zoning through 8-30G. We are also one of a handful of states that has been very in the lead on ensuring that regulatory costs at the local level are not excessive. About half the country allows impact fees. They can be $25,000, $30,000 per unit. We prohibit those. We also limit fees to be what it is the cost for municipality to review. We don't have a handle on material cost and availability. We've seen that during the pandemic, but not just the cost of lumber, but the availability of windows and doors. Next to our office, a building has been delayed for 6 to 9 months because they could not get windows and doors. And the entire time that's running up costs. We do not have a handle on the availability and cost of labor. We've been running numbers internally. It looks like, at least in Western Connecticut, our construction sector has fallen 14-fold in the last, I have to double check these numbers because my jaw fell on the floor when I saw it, but there's been a huge decrease in the availability of labor, and we have one of the oldest construction sectors by worker age in the country. And of course, lending has become increasingly challenging in the last couple of years. So there are a number of costs that are really hard for a state and local governments to get their hands on, to control, but they are driving housing affordability challenges. If I just may throw a couple other things in there, besides what we talk about in building a house, there's also the cost of owning a house and maintaining a house. We have the second highest property tax bills in the country. The property tax, as we know, is economically regressive, so it hits lower income people the hardest. Property tax is a housing cost, both for owners and renters. We are a national leader in energy costs. So property tax is about 20% of the cost of owning a home, according to our calculations. Energy can be between 3 and 10%. And then, of course, we have transportation costs that in a highly suburban state like Connecticut, suburban/exurban, basically everybody has to drive to get everywhere. And those can easily be 20% of a lower income household's housing costs. So there are a lot of issues. We have to come at this from all fronts. The good news is that I think we have a really great dedicated team here. The other thing is we have some really great assets in Connecticut. We have a population that has not been growing, or it's been very slow growth. Since 1970, our state's population has grown 19%. The number of households has grown 52%, and the number of housing units has grown 56%. So at the aggregate level, there is not a housing shortage, but we still have critical affordability gaps. So one thing we could look at that could be a quick fix is figuring out how to do what we did 100 years ago when we carved up Victorian homes into apartments. How can we better utilize the many potentially oversized homes we have? Our calculations are that there are about 1 million vacant bedrooms in Connecticut, and the cheapest home to build is a home you don't have to build because it's already there. So I threw a lot out there, but I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, eager to hear what everybody else has to say.
Hi, thank you. I'll just briefly say that we're a developer of affordable housing in Connecticut. We also work in other states, and I've been working on Connecticut affordable housing for almost 20 years now. So I've seen a lot of change over that time. I think what would be helpful for this group would be first to separate out affordability issues that are more transitory versus those that are chronic. What I mean by that is the low housing sale inventory is probably more of a transitory issue because interest rates shot up very quickly over the last year, and a lot of homeowners who might otherwise sell are just kind of hoping they can wait it out. And I think that has a series of interventions, but potentially that might be different from a chronic housing issue, such as housing costs being a high percentage of families' budgets at the lower income spectrum. That has been the case for nearly probably the entire 20 years that I've been working on affordable housing. It's gotten worse, but it has been a chronic issue. And so there's different strategies to dealing with those types of different things. And then secondly, I think with affordable housing, you also see regulatory issues versus what I would call economic issues. Regulatory issues would be things like building department standards, zoning restrictions, things that kind of cap the housing market's ability to respond to demand. So there may be high demand for housing in some towns in Connecticut, but there's no ability to build. So that kind of ends up distorting the market, creating affordability challenges. On the other hand, economic issues are things like over the last 2 years, we've seen housing costs, the cost to build housing, shoot up really significantly, faster than inflation, I would say. And that's a sort of a national economic issue. It has to do with labor shortages. It has to do with material costs, supply chains, things that are mostly outside of our control here. And you want to make sure you're not fighting issues that you just can't win on. I mean, economic issues like the cost of materials there's not much you can do to change that. So that would be my recommendation, just to make sure we're focusing what we're focusing on in each case.
No, thank you. I think that was a very quick attempt at trying to identify what the problem is, and as we've all sat here listening to everybody respond to that question, we've come to the conclusion, or at least I have, that it's incredibly complex. And I think it's often the challenge we face in this building on this particular issue is, where do you start? And I don't know that there's one place to start. I guess I'd pose that as a question to the group. I find that often this building ends up with proposals in response to wanting to do something, but not really having a strategic direction to move in, at least one that's informed by lots of people who actually know what we're talking about. And I'm not saying legislators don't know what we're talking about, but perhaps we know less than all of you who do this on a day-to-day basis. And do it in the real world, and not that this building is not the real world, but you are at the end of implementing a lot of the policies that we enact, and often the policies that we pass are informed by the people that come before us, but we aren't always able to capture everything that is preferred, desired, or even recommended from the members of the public who choose to participate in this process while we formulate policy. So I think one of the key things is, to your point, is not fight the battles we can't fight, right? I mean, I know Senator Duff referred to chicken or the egg. I heard a little bit about that, right? We need the housing to warrant perhaps building transportation to connected housing, but then we know that we can't get the housing because nobody wants to live there because you can't get there, right? So those chicken and egg issues are very real, and we can't get too caught up in them, but we do have to recognize that they are real, to your point, as well. But I'd be interested to know, like, where do we start attacking this issue, I guess?
A few ideas that I can relate to personally and what we're going through in Ridgefield, in the Branchville section of our town. We had a walk audit, Desegregate Connecticut, on Saturday. Probably the hottest day of the year, but we did nonetheless walk. It was interesting to hear the feedback from people, the chicken and the egg. For example, our parking lot for our train station is pretty much empty right now. So the idea of maybe converting it to housing, but people said, well, if we build, it's about 400 units, where are all these cars going to go? Look what it's going to do to traffic. And I said, well, if we build it, maybe we can get the investment in the train service, increasing the level of service, become more dependable. It's a modernization. It is so lacking with transportation, or rail system specifically, that people don't rely on it. Our traffic patterns are all back to where they were pre-pandemic. Few people are coming back to the train, and hopefully it'll continue to grow over time, but everyone is driving today. And for the people who live in the area that are concerned about this type of a build-out, it's a concern about traffic on the roads. And the other section, or other area of concern, is sewer, and that's been brought up several times relative to infrastructure. We have a sewer plant in Georgetown and Reading, owned by Reading. It's rated at 245,000 gallons per day, but yet is only flowing 40. And that's been the case for years, and it's extremely expensive to keep a plant. For those of you who understand that, operating in the bacteria generated that you need in a system like that. We have been trying for years to get into the plant, to get a pipe up into the Branchville area that would allow us to build the type of density. I think we need to look at areas where there are those situations that present themselves with transportation possibilities, sewer capacity, or have a better understanding of what new sewer or septic system technology may be out there, so that if you don't have a sewer, you have the ability to put in a septic system that'll handle a greater density. And then the public relations part of it and how you sell it. But I think we need to sit down, both municipalities and the state, like we're doing here, discuss the issues, define the problems, which we're trying to do. Stanford, Francis, I think there was a statistic over the last 20 years, built over 2,200 units of affordability, somewhere in that area. They led. And you say, well, why did Stanford build so many units? And it's because the demand was there. People were comfortable with their families, commuting to work. They could take a bus, walk, take the train a little bit. We need to take a look at that, and how do we expand that out into the suburbs to make people feel more comfortable that they can get to their jobs, even if they are in the cities. They're able to commute to the cities. They can get out to the suburbs, live in a different environment, and be successful. One of the things we do with affordable housing, and I'm sorry about this, these thoughts are coming to my head. We offer affordable housing to people with a restriction, like a condominium. If they're able to get into a condominium, there's a restriction on what they can sell it for. So all of us, I know I did when my wife and I started out, we bought what we could afford, sweat equity, you build that up and you sell it to use to move on and hopefully improve your family's living conditions. I think 8-30G stifles that. It doesn't allow people to make any profit, so you get stuck in a house. That's great, but how do you create any equity to move forward? I think we need to look at 8-30G real hard and apply it to today's reality of what affordable housing is, and is it meant to lock people in for 40 years, or is it meant as a stepping stone to get people moving through the system into successful lives for themselves and for their children? Those are just a few of the things.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond real quick too, and I'm going to go off memory here from a meeting on Friday, but I believe there's demand all over the place, all over Connecticut, but especially all over Fairfield County. There was a shoreline community in Fairfield County that we heard about that had, was it four slots for affordable housing from the Housing Authority? 4. And they received over 3,000 new applications for affordable housing. So the demand, I believe the demand is in Ridgefield, it's in Fairfield, it's in Norwalk, it's in Stanford, it's in Darien. When you see four slots available for folks for housing vouchers, if that's what it is, and 3,000 people trying to get on that trying to get housing, that should tell you that we're past, we've got to discuss this, but we're far past just polite conversations. We have to get into the fact of actually doing something and being a little uncomfortable and putting some shovels in the ground on housing, because we will fail as a state if we do not build more housing across the state.
But I think we're going to need, excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead.
We have to be partners in this, because a municipality can't fund these kinds of projects. A sewer line is going to cost us $7-8 million to bring up into that area. Private landowners are all set to go, but everyone's looking at everyone saying, okay, who's going to pay for the sewer line? How are we going to get it up into that area? I think if once you do the infrastructure and you get it in place, the private sector can take care of it and provide the housing we need.
Francis.
Yes, thank you. I think what is perhaps daunting about this is that it's so complex and this pie has so many slices, right? And it's not just slices, it's also, there's a temporal factor. As the gentleman to my left said, some of it is long-term chronic, some is acute. And so perhaps systematizing is breaking it down into various sub-aspects, say zoning or lending or property ownership, property tax might help make it a little bit less scary for us.
One of the things that has come up when we've had conversations about this is that there are some competing demands. So as much as municipalities are trying to address housing needs, they're also trying to face environmental challenges, address climate change, the need for greater resiliency, and there seems to be a reluctance to try to address that in a way that makes sense. We do have wetlands, watershed lands that need protection, and so there are some areas of the state that are in sewer avoidance areas as designated by EPA and DEEP. And so I think we need to have a conversation about how to address that, because when we have had communities want to expand sewer capacity, kind of bumping up against the issues that Rudy has faced in Ridgefield. I know the town of Coventry, for example, wanted to expand capacity with the town of Bolton, and they had to get a special act to address that issue because DEEP was opposing that. And so we need to get some of the regulators involved in these discussions to find out what it is we can do and what it is we can't do, because those are environmentally sensitive lands. And I don't feel like we've had that balanced discussion as part of efforts to address affordable housing.
There's probably, I would imagine there's probably frustration from the town and city, the town side to the legislature, but there's also frustration from the legislature to the town side, because we see sometimes where the town, they're blocking housing from being built, and maybe we have on our side, we should be doing things that make it a little bit easier as well. And I think the Transfer Act is a good example, or some other places where sewers or other water where we can maybe be partners, and that would be something to do, smart to do.
I'm going to try to wrap up this discussion. I'll surprise everybody. We're hoping to end the meeting earlier than noon, which no one will object to. But I didn't want to cut anybody off from offering any kind of final thoughts on at least this round of trying to define the problem, which we haven't done yet because there's like a million ideas of what the problem is. But hopefully we've taken some good notes. We'll try to synthesize that down into something that perhaps we can present to the rest of the group that you can then react to help us get around identifying what the problem is. So I think in the next couple of meetings we'll work on, as we get a schedule going and we think about ideas that we want to talk about at that meeting, we'll figure out who's ready to go first, perhaps in presenting on some of these existing topics, just so that we all have a clear lay of the land. And I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that, or. And then Section C, which has been referred to already a little bit. I know DOT talked about it, right? Conversion of state properties. That's something that was on a lot of individuals' minds as well, too. I'm sure the state does own lots of land. That doesn't mean that every piece of land should necessarily be converted to some other use. I often think about DOT and the land holdings you might have, but you need to think 30 years from now about a right-of-way that you might need, and it's not necessarily that we can convert a piece of land, but we also know that there are opportunities there for us to help us achieve this goal that we have by using existing resources that the state has. There's been a lot of talk about conversion of commercial properties. Obviously, coming out of the pandemic, we know commercial properties have been significantly impacted in terms of their demand and what the future holds for commercial properties. We know we have a number of office buildings here in the city of Hartford that are not empty, but empty-ish, or on certain days they are very empty. What's going to become of those properties? I think people in their minds have this notion that we can just convert a property to housing, but if it doesn't have sprinklers, if it doesn't have lots of other issues, it becomes a far larger obstacle to overcome to just simply convert some of these commercial properties to housing. But we also know, again, there's an opportunity there, and I think getting some folks to come in, and this is not new, but fairly new out there in the development world of conversion of commercial properties. And we know there's some initial thoughts that have been out there by subject matter experts who we might benefit from hearing from and trying to figure out exactly what's needed, whether it's incentives, whether it's some other state funding program to help with conversions. But that's another topic that we will talk about. Was already referenced as well, looking at what other states are doing in terms of models and best practices that exist in other states that we can avail ourselves of. And then other initiatives and topics. Many of you might have your own ideas that you think we should consider, and we are all ears for taking your ideas and suggestions, and as well as speakers who we might want to have come in and help inform this process, with the hope that we can have some ideas to consider in the legislature in the next legislative session. Although I'm not in a rush to just put ideas out there before the legislature. I want to make sure that we're actually putting ideas out there that are going to move the needle and not just cause a lot of rancor that often results in this building when affordable housing or housing proposals are put forward before the legislature. I think it's in our best interest to try to avoid that for as long as we can, going back into it, knowing that we'll probably get there sooner than we'd like. But I'm hoping that we can take this opportunity, given the folks who are around the table, given the interests of both majority leaders in both chambers, and certainly from our Republican colleagues too, who I think are committed to finding solutions to this, to actually really getting at some, so that we can avoid. I know Representative Carthy Vahey left, Representative Luxemburg's here, and Cabros DeGraw and Senator Rahman, the 24-hour public hearings on issues, on an issue everybody cares about, but spends a lot of time kind of throwing shade at each other, either in person or on social media, and that's not really serving anybody's interest. So I will stop talking with that. Senator Duff, I don't know if you have any closing comments.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank everybody for being here today, and my apologies for being late. I did leave with plenty of time to get up here, so I apologize. But thank you to everybody for being here. As the House Majority Leader said, we'll do bills and legislation as needed along the way. I think we want to make sure we try and build consensus and get it right. We're more interested in that than we are of speed necessarily. And I think that we also view this as not just something that goes between July and January, but something that is more ongoing. This is an issue that is probably, for us here in the state of Connecticut, the biggest issue for us to tackle that we can as a state in housing. And so we have to make sure that we are intentional about what we're doing and that we focus, as Senator Moore said, on those who are being impacted, also our communities and towns across the state, but getting to a yes. Getting to the yes is very important to me, and however we get there, we got to get there, but we've got to make sure that we have an impact and we get to yes, and that we don't throw barriers in the way of actually building housing, which is our ultimate goal here. And we have to think about, as I've always said a lot of times, that for especially for our young people, we invest a lot of money in them in early childhood education. We invest a lot of money in them in secondary education. We invest a lot of money in them in higher education if they go through the whole process here in Connecticut. It's foolish for us to have them then move out of state because they can't find housing. That makes no sense from an investment standpoint. And it makes no sense from a job growth and an economic standpoint. We also have to make sure we're being inclusive of our seniors. There's a lot of senior housing in the state that needs to be rehabbed, that needs to be upgraded. So we have to think about that as well. But we can't use that as an excuse to not build housing for our younger people or for families who are just starting. As our first selectman said, when he first started with his wife, you buy something you can afford and you hopefully build up. That's a little bit lacking right now, is some of those 1,500 square foot houses that was mentioned earlier. And so all those things are really important. So we're going to take the time to really tackle these issues and hopefully make a real deep impact for the state, because so far it's been a lot of good intentions, but we haven't gotten nearly where we need to get to at this point. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks everybody for being part of it.
And thank you, everyone. We will probably not attempt to schedule a meeting in August, knowing vacation schedules, but we're going to regroup, kind of take all the information that we gathered today and figure out what the next plan will be, but we will certainly be in touch with all the committee members, and I really appreciate you all being here today and being part of this conversation. And with that, 11:29, we are adjourned.
This is Kirk Carr, on the record. Thank you for watching.